more about how the customs and border arrangements are going to work post March the 29th. And now that is obviously, at the moment, we are seemingly heading towards a no deal. So perhaps just talking through those scenarios in a bit more detail about what needs to change between now and then to ensure goods and supply chains continue to operate.
Do you want to have a go at that one?
If I start off by telling you a little bit about how it works presently. So being that we are a member of the European Union currently, essentially when goods move between the UK and the EU, they move in what is a tariff-free and essentially border-free environment. And that is because, as a member, we apply the EU's rulebook in regulations, in customs. We are subject to the institutional governance framework of the EU, and equally we share in the database systems that there are. That means essentially that we can obviate for the need for checks at borders. That doesn't mean that compliance is enforced. Compliance is enforced via the governmental structures, via the European Commission and the ECJ. To give you an idea, it's very difficult to say currently what that will look like exactly post-Brexit, because there are a number of different paths that we could go down. It could be a negotiated deal in March 2019, in which case we stay in a status quo arrangement for a 2-year, on just under 2-year transition. In the event that there is no deal, you would move to what would be kind of MFN, most favoured nation kind of trading arrangements with the EU. We would have no preferential agreements with the EU anymore under any legal basis. And that would necessarily increase tariff, regulatory and other administrative frictions in trade with the EU. So export side, you would expect that UK businesses beginning to export to the EU, they would face new tariffs, they would face the requirement to comply with product standards checks, compliance arrangements, they would have to submit customs declarations, they would have to prove the origins of their goods, there would be a number of kind of fiscal and administrative burdens to trade with the EU. On the import side, if we have no preferential deal with the EU, it's feasible that the government can do something slightly different. It's not necessarily the case that exactly what is currently the EU's most favoured trading arrangements would be what the UK applies. So it would be feasible for the UK to do something different on tariffs. It would be feasible for the UK to perhaps conduct some of the regulatory checks in different places, not necessarily at the border, in order to cope on day one with what would be a huge surge in capacity, need for capacity at borders. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there are a huge number of different possible outcomes from this. And export side, it might be a lot more. There might be a lot more certainty about what we would have to cope with in the event of no deal. But import side, that's somewhat in the UK's prerogative.
Dr. Potter, would you like to add anything on that in terms of the infrastructure that might be needed?
Okay. Well, I say effectively at the minute, vessels, if we look at export vessels, they have, if they're going on the ro-ro ferries, they have to have a security check currently. With sort of no deal Brexit, you're looking there at you'd have to have the animal checks, and potentially you'd need those for the facilitated customs area anyway, so any animal or plant-based products would have to have an additional check. Beyond that, you would then have customs checks to do as well if there was a no deal barrier. So all of these checks effectively add a bit of time, and one truck on its own isn't a problem. It's when you multiply that by the 200-300 you get on a particular ferry arrival that the problems come. So the infrastructure you effectively need are parking areas for trucks to queue in, waiting to get through the various checks and the checkpoint. So it's ultimately land is the key infrastructure requirement to some extent, to put the trucks in ahead of their depart, either before the check or after it, or even both, because what you'll find, I think, is that operators will change their habits, that if there's going to be a queue, they'll arrive earlier at the port, which then means you need to make sure you've got the space for them after the checks, but before the boat arrives.
So in effect, Anglesey becomes a car park?
Parts of Anglesey become a car park.
Thank you. If I could then ask you, the changes to the trade and customs arrangements at UK level, how do you think they may affect Wales? Do you think that disproportionately they're going to affect Wales, and how, in what way?
I think I mean, it's difficult to judge exactly because, again, we're talking a lot of the implications for the UK will equally apply to Wales. I think where it will become a bit more disproportionate perhaps is a lot of Welsh trade goes to Europe, either Ireland one way or mainland Europe in the other direction. So you may well see some issues there. Equally, the Welsh economy has got a strong agricultural foundation, and that's really where there's a potentially for extra checks on the to do with the making sure the animals are being kept well and all those kinds of checks. So that's where I think you'll see particular impacts. Is it disproportionate to the rest of the UK? I suspect there'll be some sectors where it is disproportionate, and there's other ones that are less affected as a result.
Okay.
So to pick up on that, I agree that in terms of exports to the EU, Wales might be disproportionately affected in the sense that 60% of Welsh goods exports go to the EU, only about 40% of the UK's goods exports go to the EU. In particular sectors, as Andrew said, the agricultural sector is very important to the Welsh economy. 80%, I think, of agricultural exports go to the EU, and that kind of increases to 90% if we're talking about meat products and stuff like that. So that in that sense, yes. Equally, looking at the other kind of side of that goods economy, manufacturing side of that, Wales, like the rest of the UK, I would say, the manufacturing industry in Wales is primarily concentrated in high-value, high-tech manufacturing. Probably the perfect example of that is the Airbus supply line, and that is one particular pinch point that Wales will experience, because, as I understand it, the Airbus plant in Wales is the only one that supplies Airbus wings for the EU manufacturing line. So if we're talking about and let's
just in time.
Yeah, exactly. So aerospace supply chains are very, very unique in that it's not just a highly regulated sector. This is a sector that relies on just-in-time production. Component parts arrive an hour before they're necessary on the production line and are used. So if there is any additional friction in that system, and it can be small, it reduces the competitiveness of the particular Welsh business of Airbus, of the Airbus plant in Broughton in this case, in that supply chain, and and that will have a disproportionate effect, therefore, on Wales.
Okay.
So it could be, from what you're saying,